Hello and welcome. I'm Teresa Fears from the ARC of Spokane. This short presentation is about providing education to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to prevent sexual abuse and exploitation. Sexual abuse prevention is rooted in accepting that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have sexual feelings and desires. To be successful, prevention education must include the person with an intellectual or developmental disability, their parents and other family members, teachers, disability service professionals, and members of the larger community, such as first responders and medical professionals. Without education, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are more vulnerable to abuse. Without education, families, teachers, disability professionals, and the larger community misidentify normal sexual expression as problem behaviors. This presentation will focus on the educational needs of children, youth, and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Prevention education consists of 4 interconnected content areas. They are social-emotional, relationship, abuse recognition and response, and comprehensive sex education. Let's look at each of these areas individually. Social-emotional education makes possible the development and maintenance of friendships. These skills consist of empathy, being able to recognize and consider the feelings of others; boundaries, understanding that everyone has boundaries and that different types of relationships have different boundaries; and communication, expressing your needs and ideas in a respectful way. Communication also includes the important sub-skill of active listening. Relationship information includes being aware of and being able to differentiate between the many types of relationships, being able to identify what makes a relationship healthy, and consent. In this context, consent is about asking for permission. An example of using consent would be asking for permission before hugging someone. Abuse recognition begins with accepting the reality of perpetrators. It's hard for most people to believe that there are those who intentionally harm children and vulnerable people. It is far more comforting to believe that it isn't happening, but that would be denial. Perpetrators know how strong denial is. In fact, they depend on it. When victims and caregivers reject even the possibility of sexual abuse, they remain ignorant of predatory grooming behaviors and the signs of abuse. However, with knowledge, it becomes possible to recognize abusive behaviors and then to respond appropriately to the situation. Research consistently finds that most victims with intellectual and developmental disabilities receive little or no sex education. This finding has been so consistent that it has even been identified as a risk factor. Children, youth, and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities must be given sex education if this risk is to be removed. Children, youth, and adults need different information due to their intellectual, emotional, and physical development. The following information is intended to address the general educational needs of children and adults. The needs of youth will be more comprehensively addressed, as that is the population I have been working with for several years. Essential information for children up to puberty includes personal boundaries, social boundaries, friendship skills, which include empathy, sharing, listening, and taking turns; autonomy, which is knowing that they have the right to say no to touch from anyone, knowing that they can ask for help; and age-appropriate sex education. For this group, that would include knowing the names of body parts and knowing about private and public actions and places. The term youth includes teens and young adults to age 21. Youth need to have information in the following areas: relationships, social and community norms, safety, and comprehensive sex education. Relationship information includes knowing the difference between a friend and an acquaintance. This is important for all youth and especially to those who are preparing for employment or independent living. Having a working definition of boyfriend and girlfriend and knowing how this relationship is different from other relationships. This is possibly the most important relationship for this age group. Unfortunately, many youth get their information about dating and intimate relationships from the internet, their friends, or movies and TV. How different relationships have different boundaries. Abuse is a lot easier when boundaries are fuzzy and people don't know what behaviors belong in which relationships. And finally, the meaning of sex. Sex without consent is an invitation to a perpetrator who will be more than happy to create an opportunistic context for their victims. Social norms. Youth actually need to be told about the social norms that are a part of all relationships. This information needs to be both specific and concrete. Consent. In addition to consent as permission, youth also need to know that consent has a specific meaning in sexual assault laws. Social media safety. If youth have access to smartphones, tablets, e-readers, or laptops, they must also be educated about how to use them safely. This information should include what behaviors to look out for, what to do if they are approached online, and who to tell. Safety education includes knowledge of behaviors that indicate abuse. For example, jealousy is part of an over-controlling and therefore abusive relationship. Knowledge of behaviors that are abusive. For example, knowing that being slapped or punched is abuse. Knowing who to ask for help. This includes being able to identify and name safe adults and knowing about community resources such as Adult Protective Service or local sexual assault or domestic violence centers. Knowing how to ask for help. This includes being able to correctly name body parts, being able to name the type of abuse, and knowing that they can have an advocate present when reporting abuse. Comprehensive sex education is necessary for the prevention of sexual abuse of youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It should include, but is not limited to, anatomy and physiology, reproduction and birth control, sexual health and hygiene, sexual decision-making, and sexually transmitted diseases. Information should be offered in the format most accessible to the youth and at their level of understanding. Adults need basically the same information that children and youth do. They need to understand what makes a relationship healthy, about the need for consent, how relationships at work are different from other relationships, how to recognize, name, and report abuse, and, if necessary, remedial sex education. Many adults need remedial sex education. However, it is generally not provided until behaviors related to sexuality cause disruption to families or service providers. Unfortunately, there is no one agency tasked with providing this information to adults. Unless an agency or organization in your community is willing to offer this education, it will need to be provided by parents or service providers. One educational approach to abuse prevention is to use the Healthy Relationships model. This approach addresses 3 of the 4 educational needs. They are social-emotional, relationship, and abuse recognition and response. The Healthy Relationship model does not include sex education. This is because public schools already have the option of providing this important subject to their students. If your public school is not providing sex education to your child with a disability, you might want to consider contacting the teacher, the principal, or the superintendent of public education to ask why. In the Healthy Relationship model, information flows as follows. It begins with defining fundamental terms such as healthy and relationship. Then it introduces the concept of personal boundaries. From there, it moves to naming and differentiating between types of relationships. Next, using the definition of healthy as a baseline, behaviors are identified as healthy or unhealthy, and relationships are identified as healthy or unhealthy. The final step is being able to name the type of abuse, identify who to ask for help, and knowing how to ask for help effectively. The goal of the healthy relationship approach is to provide specific information that will allow a person with an intellectual or developmental disability to recognize abuse through behaviors in any type of relationship. Having a functional definition of the word healthy is core to this approach. For a relationship to be healthy, it needs to have the following three things: respect, which is defined as remembering that people have feelings; trust, which is defined as something to be earned over time; and choice, the right of both people in a relationship to be able to make their own decisions free of coercion. All three elements must be in the relationship for it to be called healthy. Unhealthy is defined as something that is not good for you. Relationships that are unhealthy are missing one of the three core elements. Focusing on behavior to identify healthy or unhealthy relationships is necessary because many abuse prevention programs focus only on intimate or dating relationships. This can give the false impression that other types of relationships are free from abuse. Unfortunately, abuse can be found in all types of relationships. In fact, having any relationship with a victim creates access for the perpetrator. As you can see, one study found that 92% of the sexual abuse of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities happened within a relationship. These relationships included friends, acquaintances, family members, and disability professionals. Please note that only 8% were strangers. Addressing the use of relationship to gain access to abused people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is why the healthy relationship model was created. If we are serious about sexual abuse prevention of children, youth, and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, then they must receive an education that will prepare them for safer, healthier relationships. The next 3 slides have resources on relationship skills, sexual development, and a free curriculum based on the healthy relationship model. These books address building skills. The first book was written for children who have autism and hyperactivity disorders, but the information is applicable for any child with an intellectual or developmental disability. The second and third books have not been reviewed, but are from reputable publishing houses that specialize in disability-related materials. These are some resources addressing sexual development. The first resource is written for parents of children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Despite its title, it is appropriate for many types of disabilities. The Healthy Bodies Guides were written, again, specifically for parents. They are an excellent free resource. You can find both the boys' version and the girls' version at the ARC of Spokane website. The Family Life and Sexual Health, or FLASH curriculum, is used in many Washington State public schools. It is a comprehensive sex education program and has lessons from 4th grade through high school. There are also sets of lessons written for youth and special education classes. These are free and available on the website. These resources address sexuality in general. The first book is a combination of information for parents and true stories by parents. The stories highlight parents' feelings and reactions about how they came to terms with their child's sexuality. The second is a product of the ARC of Spokane's Partnership for Safety program. It uses the healthy relationship model and has been used in Spokane area school transition programs and special education high school classes for several years. The curriculum consists of a 52-page workbook for youth, a teacher's guide, 3 picture packs, and a bingo game. It is all free and can be downloaded from the ARC of Spokane website. There is also a YouTube walkthrough for the workbook for those who would like to learn more about this approach to abuse prevention. Thank you for watching this presentation. I hope you will consider education as prevention and also consider the healthy relationships approach. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. If you are interested in this subject, you might want to view my other presentations, Sexual Abuse Prevention and How to Use the Healthy Relationships Curriculum. The Healthy Relationships Curriculum and these YouTube presentations are made possible by grants from the Centers for Disease Control and the State of Washington.